Welcome to Cybersecurity Shall Be C-Level Priority, the podcast that puts the digital world to the test. Cyber attacks are on the rise, and data is the most valuable asset in today's world. But how can we protect what matters most to us? Drawing on the latest insights, effective strategies, and practical tools, we'll show you how to create a more secure digital environment. Because one thing is clear, security isn't negotiable, it's a top priority.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode. Cybersecurity is a top priority, the podcast. Today with Timo. Hey, Timo.
Hi, Nico. It's great to be here.
Everyone who doesn't know you yet, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So actually, I always love to start by talking about that with the field of information security. That's where I started getting into it. In the 8th grade, back then, I saw Hackers on the FBI network with Angelina Jolie for the first time. I think I watched that movie every day back then. And I actually started hacking our school network. So if our former administrator is listening right now, greetings. And I could actually change grades in report cards. And then I helped to correct everything. That's how it all started. I actually studied information security at TU Darmstadt. I started, and then in my first years, in my professional life, I practically began at Lufthansa Industry Solutions as a penetration tester. From there, I then went to Deutsche Bahn. There, I worked in the CISO area and later took over the team focused on information security assurance. So everything that has to do with offensive security measures. And then the next stop was actually, and that fits nicely with the topic today, I'm the CISO of a large running shoe manufacturer from Switzerland, where I practically took on the topic of security as the first dedicated security hire. And from there, I decided to go to operational services. Now I'm here as the head of security and audit. We are service providers for companies of all sizes, from small, medium-sized companies to large corporations across all industries. And we provide consulting in the area of security, but we also offer external information security offices. And yes, that's where we got to know each other in that role, because we also started working together. And now I'm looking forward to talking a bit with you about today's topic.
You've already teased the topic a bit. We want to talk about that. How do I become a CISO? Or rather, I want to address this cliche right away. Today, we're not specifically focusing on the term CISO, but rather on the general topic of how to be successful in the field of information security, or what obstacles or hurdles are there on this path. And above all, we want to stir up that cliche, or rather break it down. What exactly is a CISO? Because we discussed a lot back and forth before the recording started. It got a bit heated when I said, great, we can get started with the podcast right away. Because for me, this image, what in many people's minds, there is already a big and false image of a CISO. I've mentioned this in dozens of podcasts that I've done by now. It's been mentioned time and again that there should be this all-in-one CISO in the eyes of many companies. Now, we've already touched on the second topic in advance. That was also a topic in the discussion. So today we're mixing the topics together. But before we talk about that, what exactly is a CISO? Or rather, how does one become a CISO? Maybe first the question to you. You've already hinted a bit at your career path. What did you do? What qualifications should a CISO have? Or rather, what is your experience? What should a CISO bring to the table?
So qualifications, I can only speak for myself. I have cyber security, so IT security. That means officially studied, but I don't think you need to have studied that or that you need to have like 5,000 certificates for it. I think you need to have an understanding of what security measures a company needs to cover it practically from every angle. So often when you think of cybersecurity, you always think directly of the hacker. But for companies, for example, the topic of BCM, which is business continuity management, is much more important because you can't fend off every attacker. But then it's also important that you fend off many attackers, so as many as possible. And then you also have the option that you need to deal with when you're a CISO, just a little bit, okay, what happens now if I couldn't fend off an attacker, but I don't have to go into business continuity management yet? So how do I recognize that I'm being attacked right now? How can I practically contain attacks? And I actually believe that the biggest competence a CISO needs is integration, the technical measures, therefore, up to the organizational measures. But it's not just about measures, but also about creating understanding on both sides. What I see quite often are the GRC colleagues. So those who take care of governance, risk, and compliance, they always say, yeah, the techies, they don't really do it right anyway. And the techies always say, what do we need these policies for? Writer, we can solve all of this technologically. And I believe the most important thing is to have what I always call a holistic approach. So a holistic has a perspective on the topic of security and can communicate well with all kinds of people and talk to top management. And for that, I believe you also need your own drive to get the right people on board. I believe those are the core competencies.
You brought up an important topic, and I would like to delve into it a bit more. And you said, above all, a CISO isn't always the techie, but they also don't have to only represent governance. Now, I've often noticed this, that many people say a CISO must also have technical understanding. I myself am also a CISO for buying dozens of companies as an external consultant. I don't call myself a CISO either, but I call myself part of the information and security team, even if it's always predicted that way, that I am an external CISO. In the end, I often hear the question, even in my community, a CISO must also have technical understanding. They have to understand where it's being discussed. What do you think about that? So how deep does the CISO need to understand something technically? Or do you say it's enough for them to just be there in an advisory capacity, that they can understand both the technical side, but also the governance side? Or should a CISO perhaps specialize in governance or technology?
Personally, I don't believe they should specialize in either of the two areas. I believe they should have a certain level of understanding of everything. I'll try to explain it this way. A CISO doesn't need to be able to configure a firewall or conduct a pen test, but they need to have a rough understanding when there is a finding in a penetration test. What risks does that pose for their company? Namely, first and foremost, what risk does that pose for this system that was pen tested? And how do I derive the overall risks for my company? And what are the right risks, countermeasures, or countermeasure domains? I find that even more important, that you need to implement to counter this risk. Why did I use the term countermeasure domains? So one domain could be you need to separate networks. That could be one such countermeasure domain. Whether you implement direct zero trust comprehensively or whether you start with micro-segmentation or a holistic segmentation, that's not so relevant for the CISO. So it is relevant for him later on. What exactly is being done, because it has different costs, but for him, it needs to be clear first, okay, we need segmentation. And then there are experts who can support him with that. For example, finding the right technology for segmentation or the right approach, the right process. That means he needs to have a certain level of understanding of everything, some knowledge, but he doesn't need to understand everything down to the smallest detail. But he always thinks from the outcome perspective. He is a leader, and leaders think from the outcome perspective. And if the outcome is right, then he has his experts who will advise him in detail. That's my opinion. What about yours?
So I would say I can absolutely agree with your opinion 100%. But one thing needs to be made very clear. I would say that would be the dream world of a CISO. I'll say in the realistic world, unfortunately, it looks quite different. Namely, the CISO is usually alone. So I know many CISOs, ISBs, whatever you want to call them, who have this role, the advisor. I see the CISO as an advisor. He should advise the management and share information, or also make decisions regarding information security, cybersecurity in a company. The problem, what most CISOs have in many companies, I don't want to say that it's the case in all companies, but in many companies where I've noticed that they are alone, they're just, as we say in German, the all-purpose solution. Now I'm using the term again, but I love this term because it says so. Much as it unfortunately happens in today's world, a CISO has to be an all-purpose solution. He needs to be very knowledgeable on the technical side when it comes to IT topics, but also be knowledgeable on the management side. Because in the end, he has to provide the management with the decision, or at least should make a decision. Whether the management takes it on board or not, that's a whole different matter. That means I often see in reality that CISOs frequently encounter, let's say, gray areas where they don't have the expertise or the experience. Then they try to get through somehow, and in the end, it just doesn't work out. Then it fails because they don't admit it to themselves and say, okay, up to this point and no further. And I think what's important here is what you're saying again. A CISO has an advisory role. They must advise the management, and the CISO can always gather information from their IT department, from colleagues in IT, or from colleagues in legal and compliance. They can seek advice there. They can also seek external advice to ultimately make a decision together. And I believe that's an important point. A CISO doesn't have to be a jack of all trades. And for me, a CISO can also have a passion for the technology or even against the technology. That doesn't exclude the whole thing for me. I also have a passion for certain topics. And of course, I would dive deeper into these topics than I do now in other topics. But at the end of the day, a CISO is a generalist. They need to have an overall view and ultimately represent that to their management. And that's why it is the case that if you are now a jack of all trades or a one-man show in a company, you should always think about that. Okay, what are my multipliers in the company, or who can I talk to about this? Who can help me with that? And I believe that for me, the most important quality of a CISO is this humanity. This, I like to call it a kindergarten teacher for everyone. I don't mean that in a bad way, but I really mean it. You're sitting at a table. On one side is IT. On the other side sits management, and maybe compliance is sitting there too. And everyone is arguing with each other. Who stole the spoon or who stole the lollipop? And you have to somehow try to bring some calm into it and make sure that all sides understand each other. So to make the whole thing a bit clearer, let's take your firewall as an example again. Management might first focus on usability, wanting to simply get into their company, or rather connect me so that my employees have fewer problems. Compliance says, for example, but we have a policy that does it this way or that way, or we need to pay attention to this. Or IT says, but we want to have this and that. And in the end, the CISO sits there and has to try to bring something together from all these worlds so that it works for all sides and that it possibly works with compromises. And for me, that's the greatest gift a CISO must have these days, namely in dealing with people, talking to people, frequently convincing people, and also sometimes getting caught in the crossfire in a dispute, like that kindergarten teacher role.
You just said two things that I find really interesting. And one thing is about the jack of all trades. I always have this saying on my lips: he who wants to be good at everything can't do anything right. And I believe a CISO shouldn't get caught up in being an expert in every single topic area, because security is so broad anyway, but should say, okay, I will also let myself be advised by experts, so that with this collected knowledge from various experts, I can take a step higher. As you just called it, the advisor to the board. That's one thing I find really interesting. And there we have it too. The same opinion. And the other thing, you just brought up the example with the firewall. I would take another example: information security and human resources. And many companies, so information security is more than just pure IT security. It involves all the information that affect the company. And especially in the human resources department, a CISO wouldn't change contracts with future employees themselves, but he would give recommendations, what needs to be included, whether you need some kind of security check for a single company, or if you need to look at certain information security policies right at the beginning of your employment. And he will give all these recommendations. How it will be implemented later, it's the decision-making power of the HR department along with the lawyers. But it's more about this advisory role of the CISO for the HR department. And I think that makes it even easier than if we were to just focus on the technical side The CISO is responsible for the information of the entire company and therefore has a cross-sectional role across all departments.
You're bringing up an important topic. We already talked about this beforehand. Before we take a step back again, let's do it. We've already made a few more steps forward, but I think it's a great discussion. So let's keep it that way. You just mentioned it. The CISO is also an advisor to the management and interacts with the management. How do you see that from your experience? Where does a CISO actually sit? That's also a common point of contention. What I keep seeing, CISO, C-level. Many wish for it or think about it, but that's usually not the case. How do you see it?
You have already fought battles for me there. I'll be completely honest. So I would first start by distinguishing between the ISB and the CISO. I believe the Information Security Officer, ISB, is appointed, and the CISO appoints themselves more or less if they are truly a proper CISO who stands next to the CTO or CIO. And I think that's another big difference, that an ISB is not the same as a CISO. And because he has less decision-making authority, but still similar responsibilities, which always makes it difficult. I believe I am an ISO because my personal experience says that decision-making authority and responsibility should always be balanced somewhere. I believe it's simply better for the CISO if they are placed in the right position. From my perspective, the right position is next to the CIO and next to the CTO and not in the technology department. Well, I myself was also a CISO. I was 2 reporting lines below the CTO. And that was really difficult because the CTO has a budget and they have to decide for themselves, should I invest this now in new features or in risk mitigation, where I don't even know if the risk even materializes. And if I were the CTO, I would know how to make decisions. And that's how the CTO decided, namely in the features, because that's what keeps a company running. And I think that makes it difficult. One way to be a CISO, below the CTOs or below the CIOs, works when he gets a dedicated budget that no one else interferes with. And there is also a direct reporting line to the CFO or whoever else. So we had that, I always call it a dotted line. So if there is such a dotted line, that it can go directly to the board for certain important issues. And I believe, because that's also the topic of the podcast, this is another very important issue. What does a CISO need? And I believe a CISO or an information security officer also needs a passive process competence. I stole the word from Gunther Duck. Just as the CTO of IBM, he needs to understand, how does the company operate relatively quickly? He needs to understand his role in the company and then quickly figure out where he positions himself to bring maximum value for the security of the entire company into the organization.
And you're bringing up an important point. For me, a CISO also needs to be a networker. So I've been in this CISO role a lot, both externally and internally. And what I've seen time and again, you need to be able to network. You not only need to network with decision makers, but also with the people below who are the executing body, who also have to do that. Or a simple example you just mentioned with the IT department. For example, I was employed at my company where I worked as a CISO under the IT manager. And my problem wasn't that the IT manager was constantly sabotaging me or saying, hey, you can't do anything or something like that. That would be a simple issue. But exactly as you said, the budget is one thing, but the other issue is the implementation. Hey, you can't do anything like that. That would be a simple issue. But exactly as you said, the budget is one thing, but the other issue is the implementation. As a CISO, I have to provide advisory for topics that the IT might then need to implement. And that was always a huge drama because it's all about, I say something, then IT has to implement it. The one who has to decide that how this works in terms of costs and budget is just my boss. And then my boss naturally approached me more often and said, hey, can't you do it this way or that way? Or can't we do it this way or that way? Of course, I also had a dotted line to the managing director. But what does a managing director do at the end of the day? He naturally gathers multiple pieces of information. He naturally asks the IT manager or has a conversation with them, and they say how they are looking for it and so on and so forth. So these competency levels, I'll call them competency levels. For now, maybe that's not the right term, but for me, it's also a big issue. It's why many CISOs can't work effectively because they end up being held back. Or that brings us back to another topic, certificates, because in the end, the company doesn't support the CISO, but rather the CISO is just there to hold up some nice certificate or to say, we do information security. And I think that's a bit of the fundamental problem or the basic challenge for every CISO. I know there are many companies that see it differently now, and I myself am currently planning to create a podcast on a super exciting topic. Just to mention in advance, I don't know when it will be published. So I just wanted to point that out, where we talk to a CISO and the CIO of a company. That means the CISO sits under the CIO and they explain how that works. Can that even work? Where are the friction points? And so on. Because I see this very, very often that depending on where the CISO sits or where the CISO reports to, it can also lead to problems. But to get back to the topic, because we said we skipped a few things. Let's go back to the beginning. We talked about it once. What was your career path like, and how do you view such a path as a CISO? We've already talked about this off tech. There are now institutions that offer workshops or training sessions for CISOs. What do you think about something like that? Do you think that really helps for someone who wants to develop in that area? To sit down there for a week or two and do some CISO training, to get refueled?
I consider that just as valuable as training for a CEO. I believe that with experience, commitment, and a broad knowledge base, you can achieve more than with such training. Do I perhaps sound harsh to the providers of this training? But I don't believe you can train someone to be a CISO. I believe that you can teach someone with training a broad knowledge of the entire scope of information security, that he is practical. The technical part, the one I mentioned earlier, the holistic part that a CISO needs is learned. But acting as a CISO is more than that, because it requires what in English is called managerial courage. You really need this presence as a central role, someone who thinks holistically and also thinks across departments. Managerial courage. You really need this presence as a central role. Who thinks holistically, who also thinks across departments. And I don't think you can necessarily teach that to everyone. You don't have to. But I also believe that, as you mentioned, the all-in-one solution, that not every goal has to be this all-in-one solution. And that in many companies, I believe, people can be trained for this role without such training, just with the right interest and the right drive. You can train someone for this role without that training, without doing anything else on the side. Earlier, I said that this is an enabler, and an enabler means, yes, you support other departments in implementing something in a secure way, so that the overall risk for the company does not increase and ideally is even reduced. And I believe those are core competencies that a CISO must bring with them. And you learn that in the first 3 to 5 years of your professional life, if you are in the right positions. And then that's the career path. So if you are placed in the right positions, and then that's the career path. As I call it, first, there are hard skills, meaning I know holistically everything you need to make a company truly secure. And then there are soft skills, meaning I know how to act within a company, that we find a consensus or that we come together in a way that is safe. And I believe those are the two essential building blocks to bring forth a good CISO, not just kind of training or anything. Someone needs an ISO 27001 auditor certification or whatever else is in the tenders. When you look at them, I think that's just a very small part of it, because a CISO is not a compliance officer, but a security officer. And I believe that's really important. It's about ensuring the security of the company and being a part of that assurance that the company is sufficiently secure. Is it that maybe everything is considered from a 27K1 or K2 perspective? But just because you are certified in 27K1 or K2 doesn't mean that you are very secure. That's always this conception.
I'm completely on your side. Now we're actually talking about the third topic that came up, namely certification. I've always held my opinion on this, and I still stand by it today, that I find certification absolutely pointless. I know do you think that's great? And many companies are also looking for certifications, whether that's the CISO, CSM, and whatever else they're called. This is often the case in tenders. But an important component, you'll never get that through. Certification, that's the reality. And as you already said, how do I communicate because as a CISO, I also have to communicate certain things with a management team, and anyone who has ever worked with a management team, you can't always talk technically with management. So I don't want to say not with every management. I've also met quite a few management people who have a lot of interest in technology and therefore want to dive very deep. But generally, management is very simply structured. They want clear information presented concisely, and you have to be able to present that first. And that's where such training doesn't help you at all. As you already said, probably some training providers would now scream and say, oh, no, that's not true. We can do it. I can only say it from my personal opinion, because you really need the practical experience. And since you also need this network within a company, and I see that as a great competence when you think about it, how do I become a CISO? You can acquire the technical knowledge, and you can certainly do that through such training. The topic of process thinking is something to acquire. But when it comes to soft skills, you really have to pay attention. You have to go that path together with your company, or you have to find your own way there. Look at how you can get on that path. Because for me, soft skills are a super important component, regardless of the technical topics and the security issues of a CISO. You need those soft skills. Otherwise, you won't be successful as a CISO.
I just had something else that came to my mind. And who was that? I believe Steve Jobs once said, we hire smart people not to tell them what to do, but so they can tell us what to do. That was such an attitude of Steve Jobs, but so they can tell us what to do. That was Steve Jobs' attitude. And I believe that very often it's something that holds back aspiring CISOs or information security officers, that they say, but you hired me, that I'm here to ensure more security. And don't you follow me? And I believe that's very common. That's also a misconception. Because every CEO, every board member already has something like trusted advisors. That means they already have people who have told them things that they trust. And now a new CISO comes in who is in this role for the first time. And they think, because I'm in this role, everyone believes that I know how security works. And one experience that I've often had, that's not the case. Namely DSBS. More trust is placed in existing advisors. So trusted advisors are the people you've been looking at for years as the one who is now officially responsible for the topic. And that's understandable. I believe trust has to be earned. And that brings us back to those soft skills you mentioned. I believe a very important thing is that in the first days, weeks, and even months as a CISO or in information security, you need to listen. I always tell everyone to listen for 100 days, because that's when you really understand all the processes and the different things. And then through listening, based on what you've heard, having more information to also become a trusted advisor, because you have to build trust. That happens by understanding what drives the business around and then really being able to help to solve problems.
You just brought up an important topic, which is helping to solve problems. Now, let's completely move away from that. We talked about how to become a CISO. What competencies do we see in this CISO? Our personal opinion. Now, let's talk about the topic, the challenges of a CISO. Let's set aside the fact that we don't need to tidy up the topic anymore. Where is he sitting? How does he work? And so on and so forth. What challenges do you see in your daily life as a CISO? So what happened to you during your time?
The biggest challenge is that is perceived as a solution supporter, because security people are always seen as the ones who raise their hands and say, no, that's not how it works, or as people who throw obstacles in the way. And I believe that if you do your job right, you'll also be seen as someone who helps to solve something or throw problems in people's way, throw stones in their path. And I believe that if you do your job right, you'll also be seen as someone who helps to solve something and to do it in a better way than if he hadn't been there. I think that's the big challenge, to position yourself in such a way and to be perceived that way.
How did you deal with the enormous responsibility back then or even today? I keep hearing that over and over. I once had a podcast on the topic of CISO equals burnout. For example, many CISOs suffer from burnout, although I have to say that this doesn't just apply to CISOs, but to everyone in the consulting field. I mean, I'm not saying anything new when I'm still talking about the fact that there still isn't a 40-hour work week in the consulting field. So anyone who still believes that has never worked there, but especially with the responsibility of a CISO in a company, there is also a lot of pressure on that. How do you see that?
So for me back then, I like pressure. I actually believe that pressure is only put on people from whom great things are expected. In that sense, pressure is a privilege. My very personal opinion on that. And I think you have to learn to deal with that. And you can't save the world as a lone fighter, especially if you're a CISO alone in the company. You can't save it. You have to find allies. And I believe that as soon as you have people to work with on these big challenges, so allies, right? Then the pressure isn't as great anymore because you can share it across multiple shoulders. And I think that's really important. As soon as you have allies, whether it's a dedicated team or a separate information security office, instead of just the officer, from that moment on, a bit of pressure is lifted off. I'm not really the type who likes a 9-to-5 job. I like it a bit challenging. You have more room for creativity. I think you're in a similar situation, Nico. And those are my things. I also believe that even if something goes wrong, it's often the case that there are also companies, not very often, but there are some individual companies, they have filled this role to have someone to blame. If something goes wrong, if you get hacked, and you have to be clear about this role yourself, I can't ensure it alone. I can set up the framework for that, namely with networks, with a holistic approach, that the probability that we will be attacked decreases, but it will never drop to zero. And if an application owner doesn't follow my guidelines, and that's why the system gets hacked or something else happens, unpleasant, but it's not solely my fault. It's part of my responsibility. Responsibility and blame are often used as the same thing, as synonyms, but it's not.
You're bringing up a really important topic that I keep hearing about. Guys, we are human. We make mistakes. So we live in a culture of mistakes. That's just it. It's also a topic that I keep seeing that people don't want to admit their mistakes, or rather say, okay, I have to deliver 100% so that it actually works. But that's not true. You can also deliver 10% or 20% at first. And I think that's also part of the pressure. And I'm with you. I love that too, when you have that pressure, because I think that with this pressure, you also come up with completely different ideas. You become much more creative. You start looking for other things. But you also brought up the most important point for me again, namely network. You are never alone. In your company, there are always a lot of people who might not be directly involved with the topic, who have a passion for it, or also have a passion for it. I always like to say this again, the skilled labor shortage that's being talked about by all sorts of people. Yes, we have a skilled labor shortage, but we also have just as much know-how, resources, and people in a company who want to do this or maybe can do it and who can also be supported. And that's exactly what you need to tease out a bit in the role of a CISO. Who has the passion for it? Who can support me with that? Who can I give a voice to now so that he can support me with that? And then I think you can handle that pressure that you might have. It's also very easy to break it down. And at the end of the day, you just have to admit it to yourself. You make mistakes. Mistakes are human, and it doesn't always have to be the 100% solution that don't even exist. Now, looking at the time, I might ask you 3 questions again. In relation to the topic, how is it changing, in your opinion, the CISO role? Because that's always such an interesting topic for me. I once asked an active CISO, what does he see for the future? How do you see that from your role as an internal CISO, let's say, up to external CISOs? You now have a team that sometimes does it themselves, external CISO ISB. However it is. How have you experienced that in recent years? How has the role of the CISO changed?
So I believe that in many companies, it has shifted strongly towards compliance. But I think that will go back again. I think currently, due to all the regulations that the EU has published, it's going a lot towards compliance. But now it will swing back. The pendulum will swing back. You will notice again, okay, I need the right measures in place to not just be about compliance, but really to be secure. So I believe the pendulum is swinging back right now. It's October now, and things are getting exciting. How things will continue with the S2 exactly in the coming months and years. But I think people will realize again that just being compliant isn't enough. It's one thing to be compliant, but it's another to actually be secure. The other thing, and the latter, ensures that you also implement more things in a high quality way, not just a paper tiger.
Do you see a CISO also dealing with the topic of the AI Act in the future? So a CISO should also engage more with the topic of AI, the act, and so on in the future. Engage with it? Or do you see it more from the governance perspective?
Do I have a similar opinion on the topic? Data protection. So data protection is my opinion. The data protectors describe what needs to be protected. The CISO describes how it is protected. And I believe that the topic of data security also needs to be applied in AI to ensure that companies remain confidential, that personal data remains confidential, that companies remain confidential, that personal data remains confidential, that certain things do not leave the company, or that this system is not hacked is still the responsibility of the CISO. How to handle the data internally. For me, within AI and the AI Act, it's outside the CISO's scope, competence at its best. How do you see that?
I see it the same way. I also believe that the role needs to be defined first, where the topic of AI is connected. I once had an interesting podcast about that too. Feel free to check it out, where it's exactly about what is AI, how does it work? And I also asked that question, do you see that in the role of a CISO, a data protection officer, or however you want to call it? And the answer was very clear, no, not really. That's a separate topic. And certainly you can also include that competence in an information security officer or data protection officer. But I'm also a fan of stopping adding more on top of everything. I'm already familiar with the idea that the data protection officer and the information security officer are in one role. For example, because one thought, well, data protection and information security, they somehow go together. Then we don't need an extra role for that again. But at some point, it has to stop with the workload. You can't just pile on ISB, DSB, and AI on top of each other. Then it really leads to a point where it just doesn't work anymore. And I think the topic is still so new. I don't want to say it's not new, but it's still so fresh, especially the topic of AI, which still needs to be figured out. How do I deal with that? And who is ultimately the right person for that? My last question to you, especially for those who are now thinking about it. Okay, I want to start on this path to becoming a CISO, or maybe I'm already an information security officer, and now I would like to become a CISO. Were there any people for you, mentors? Did you look at or get tips from back then? Did you get help? Did you have any that accompanied you on your journey?
All the people you can find on YouTube who deal with the topic of leadership and bringing together techies with management. So I think Simon Sinek is a really, really big authority. To mention here, I already mentioned Günter Dück earlier. There's also Ben Horowitz. The Hard Thing About Hard Things, great book. So a lot of literature. I didn't have a direct mentor. At some point, I discovered business coaching for myself. But that's actually more to shed light on the soft skills level. Otherwise, I'm afraid I can't give any tips. But all the authors and books I've just mentioned are highly recommended. Great. Highly recommended.
Great. Of course, I'll include, just like in every episode, your LinkedIn link in the comments, the video description, or in the description of the podcast. So anyone who wants to dive deeper into that with you is certainly welcome to do so. Just like with me, because that's why we do this podcast, to explain to people in part the all-in-one solution, or also how it isn't really an all-in-one solution. I'd be more than happy to do that, just like with me, because that's why we do this podcast, to explain to people in part the all-in-one solution, or also how it isn't really an all-in-one solution, or maybe to get some ideas and inspiration on how to position yourself accordingly. I want to thank you, Timo, for being here today. And that's it for this episode. Cybersecurity is a top priority, the podcast. Until next time.
Thank you, Nico. I also want to thank you for having me here.